tell me about how World War II began. So we have, we'll do a WW for World War, and they turn into a 2, and then the sign for began. In 1903, and then a 9. When Hitler, we touch our nose, our mustache, Hitler under our nose, invaded Poland, the sign for Poland. 2 engagements, the sign for engagements or time, that helped the United States, we put our hand on our heart, win, the sign for win, the Pacific, P and front, were defeating, the sign for defeating Japan at the battle, sign for battle at Midway, we go down Midway, by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima, Boom, and Nagasaki in 1945. So here we go. All right, we're going to get right into tell me about how World War II began. Here we go. World War II began in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. 2 engagements that helped the United States win the Pacific Front. We're defeating Japan at the Battle of Midway and dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Tell me about World War II leaders. And so we'll do 2 wars for World War, number 2 again, like last week. And then we'll have an axe, like we're Axis leaders. So let's chop that tree down. Axis leaders were, and the sign for Hitler, we touch under our nose for a mustache. Of Germany, the sign for Germany is the beak of the eagle. And then Tojo, we're going to touch our toe and make Japan, the sign for Japan looks like a banana. And Mussolini, we're going to be a moose. So you're a moose of Italy. We're going to do the boot for Italy. And then we're going to do again, World War II, ally leaders were Churchill, make a C, of England, the sign for England, and Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and MacArthur of the United States, and Stalin of the USSR. All right, so let's do it. So tell me about World War II leaders. Here we go. World War II, Axis leaders were Hitler of Germany, Tojo of Japan, and Mussolini of Italy. Bum, ba-dum, bum, bum, bum. World War II, Allies leaders were Churchill of England, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, and MacArthur of the United States, and Stalin of the USSR. That's the sign for communism. Tell me about the United Nations. So we have a U and N. So we do in 1945, the sign for after, and then it turns into an L. League of Nations, we make an N. And then we do failed. Boo. Failed to prevent World War II. WW and then 2. American, this put our hand on our heart. President, sign for president. Roosevelt, we make an R. And British, sign for British. Prime Minister, C for Churchill. And Soviet, the sign for communist. Soviet premier, mustache for Stalin. Began, the sign for began, the United Nations. So here we go. So tell me about the United Nations. In 1945, after the League of Nations failed to prevent World War II, American President Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Churchill, and Soviet Premier Stalin began the United Nations. Tell me about the Korean War. So we're going to do in 1950. Here's 1950. We're going to salute General Douglas D. MacArthur. He led, the sign for led, he led United Nations forces to stop, then the sign for communist. And we're going to go north, communist North Korea, from capturing, he captures all of South Korea, during, the sign for during Korean War. All right, so tell me about the Korean War. In 1950, General Douglas MacArthur led United Nations forces to stop Communist North Korea from capturing all of South Korea during the Korean War in 1950. Tell me about the Vietnam War. So we're going to make V's, and then we're going to make the sign for war. In 19, and then 1965, then the sign for president, President J for Johnson. Put our hand on our heart, sent U.S. troops, sign for troops, to stop. We're going to stop communists, make the sign for communists, and it turns into a V going north, North Vietnam, from capturing all of South Vietnam. So let's do it. So tell me about the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War in 1965, during the Vietnam War in 1965, President Johnson sent U.S. troops to stop communist North Vietnam from capturing all of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War in 1965. During the Vietnam War in 1965. Tell me about the end of the Cold War. So we're going to do in the 1980s. So 1980s, we'll pull back. British, the sign for British, Prime Minister, Margaret, M for Margaret, T for Thatcher, and put our hand on our heart for American President, Ronald, 2 R's, Reagan, worked, the sign for work, together to end, the sign for end, the Cold War, to lessen big government and strengthen the conservative movement. All right, tell me about the end of the Cold War. In the 1980s, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and American President Ronald Reagan worked together to end the Cold War, lessen big government, and strengthen the conservative movement. Tell me about the fall, show me the sign for fall, of communism. We do the sign for communism again. So we're going to do in 1989, so 1989, the communist, sign for communism. The communist dictators were like dictators. We put our hands up. Began, the sign for began. We have this in our preposition, to fall. Whoop, fell down. And E for Eastern, E for Europe. When Soviet, we'll do the sign for communism again. And general, we'll salute General Secretary and put a G at our forehead. Because remember, we had that big birthmark. But then we're going to Gorbachev. We're going to chop. And refuse, sign for refuse, no way. To send them, sign for military aid and sign for aid. So here we go. So tell me about the fall of communism. So here we go. In 1989, the communist dictators began to fall in Eastern Europe when Soviet General Secretary Gorbachev refused to send them military aid. Demonstrating apartheid was ending. Demonstrating apartheid was ending. In 1994, South African President de Klerk allowed free elections. Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first president. Demonstrating apartheid was ending.